Daryl, that was, we didn't talk ahead of time, but as we know, God is sometimes is the grand weaver, and much of what I uh, am going to bring to you tonight is, builds on what Daryl just talked about. And, he asked, is law relative? Is justice relative? Or are there some objective standards that we can look to? And depending on the lens through which, we see the world, depending on, the pair of glasses that we put on, we're going to see the world very differently. And, these secular progressive worldviews that says there is no such thing as truth, there is not a right and a wrong, there's not a good and a bad, that impacts the area of law, in a very significant way. And everything that we do when we put on this lens, we see through the lens of the Bible, and we understand that God has, given us some absolutes. There is right and wrong. There is good and bad. There is just and unjust. And if that's the lens through which we see the world, we start with the premise that God is there. Now, the secular progressives are going to say, no, you don't need that lens. You can put on your own lens, and it can be all about you and your personal autonomy. You can make it up as it goes along. It's about you and your personal identity. You don't need truth because there is no such thing as truth, and there is no such thing as God. And so in our battle of worldviews, and again, remember, the Bible tells us we're always supposed to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have. And so at the end, we want to be able to respond to these people that says there is no God, there is no truth. And I think by the time I finish tonight, hopefully we'll be able to do that. But understand that that's a very different discussion than when you're dealing with the other worldview that he talked about, the Islamic worldview. Because in that worldview, they're not contending that God doesn't exist. In fact, they're saying that he does exist. Well, at this point, then we got to apply the rule of non-contradiction. We both can't be right. What they say can't be true, and what we're saying can't be true if the two things aren't saying the same thing. And so how we respond to these different worldviews are going to depend on, who we are talking to. But let's begin by making sure we understand our own lens through which we see the world. We are hopefully in the Word every day, and we are studying his Word. And when we do that, we build relationship to him, and we see that law is not relative. We see that justice is not relative. We see that there are some objective, fixed moral absolutes, that truth exists, and that, arguments that there is no such thing as truth are wrong. And, I always just really enjoy debating professors who take these positions, and debating people who take these positions. They inevitably will say something like, well, there's no such thing as truth. If anybody asks you that, just ask them, is that true? They will inevitably say there are no moral absolutes. And if they say that to them, ask them if they're absolutely sure. Now, that's the lens through which, I want you to put on your glasses tonight, because, often not accepted in the world or academic circles today, or certainly not legal circles, Christian people know and understand that God made us in his image, that he's revealed objective moral absolutes in his law and in his creation, and they exist right here, and he's put them, on our hearts. That is how we can say that we are a government of laws and not of men. That is what distinguishes us, from a dictatorship by whoever has the biggest gun gets to say, this is what the law is. No, we are a government under the rule of law, whether or not we are in Canada or the United States or any of the Commonwealth, countries. Now, to be sure, there is massive worldview momentum saying that we're going to favor a secular standard of morality and truth, one that we can make it up as we go along. But that is why I think sometimes God made people like Daryl and calls him to do courses like this one. And so this evening here in the United States, and it's a few hours earlier, I suppose it's the afternoon for you folks out on the west side of Canada. I hope to spend some time explaining and exploring how we have shifted in Canada, especially, and I'll focus on Canada, but I'll take a little bit of time for the American culture, as well as what the implications are, because we've certainly seen very effective attempts to just literally evict these kind of the real truth from the Canadian, American, and I would suggest Western culture in general. Now, there are implications for that. Let's begin though. Again, I like the way, Daryl, you talked about what are we talking about when we're talking about law and governance, and if it's really interesting when you pull up the dictionaries from a couple hundred years ago, the science of government, that part of ethics. So now you would never think that the word politics or law would have anything to do with ethics, but that's the very first part of the definition 200 years ago. That part of ethics that consists of the regulation, that's law, and of government of a nation or a state, the preservation of its safety, peace, and prosperity, that's law. Comprehending the defense and existence and the rights, that's law, against foreign control or conquest, and the protection of its citizens in their rights with the preservation and improvement of their morals. Do you notice, wow, there is, in the very definition, a lens involved. If you ask somebody to define law and governance and politics today, nobody would probably, in the first 5 minutes of attempting to define it for you, talk about morality or ethics as being part of what we were talking about. Well, that's why when Daryl talks about lex rex or rex lex, it's determinative. It's significant. Either everyone, including the king, including the government, is under law, or the king is law, and therefore the government can do no wrong. Now, it's really interesting in my state of Michigan, which borders your great nation of Canada. We have got, in my experience, for the first time in since I've been following this for 40 years and working in it, we've got a government that is more like a traditional monarchy. And I'm not talking the Commonwealth or England. I'm talking about a traditional monarchy where we are being governed by edict here. The same is true in a number of the states in the nation of Australia right now, where an executive official is able, with either the stroke of a pen or by uttering something out of his or her mouth, to deem something to be right or wrong, good or bad, subject to force of law and penalty. If you don't agree with what's being said, we don't have a voting box. We don't have a legislative hearing where you can come and be heard. All we have is a jail cell or a place to pay your fine. And so it probably behooves us to bring out the Christian worldview lens. What does God say here? The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a water's course wherever he pleases. So wherever you are in the world right now, and however the amount of oppression that you feel like you're feeling, remember that God's in control. He changes times and seasons. Daniel talks about God is the one that sets up governments and brings them down. And when we look at free nations, how is it set up? I mean, you should have God at top because God's put himself at top. And then we have government, and then we have the people. And Dr. Del Tackett talks about why God has put himself in this realm and why it's so important that he does so. And why is that? Think about it. You've got normally control over how your laws are made. And all of a sudden you don't. And now all of a sudden it's governance by edict. Doesn't that suggest, just think about the suggestion of that. How much power does that give somebody in government? Now, through a Christian worldview lens, again, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. And God doesn't give too much to government. He doesn't, for example, give to government the raising of your children. He gives that to parents. He doesn't give to government, the running of church or religion. He's delegated that to the church. But what God has given to the government is maintaining order, protecting your liberty. And, the Bible talks about condone that which is good and punish that which is evil, which is why, God has said that everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Now, that can mean a tyrant that is issuing decrees that are, violating your liberties, our constitutional rights or your charter. The authorities that exist have been established by God, for he is God's servant to do good. He's an agent of wrath to bring out punishment of the wrongdoer. Now, God has given a very little slice of the world of law and governance, and not a big one. And the way it works out in Canada, for example, is not a theocracy, but certainly those who are lawmakers are to be informed by his ancient sacred tenets, the right and wrong, the just and the unjust, the truth versus the lie. For he is God's servant to do good. He's there to protect. That's what the government has been delegated. Not much again, but if God gives, and I love the way Dr. Tackett and Ravi Zacharias and some of these folks who talk about the use of the sword. When you give government that kind of power, it's important that we have a higher law. That's why God is above it. When I was appointed to the federal bench as a federal judge in the United States courts, I had to first put my hand on the Holy Bible and put my other hand toward heaven and promise that I would uphold the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God. Why was I and others that, hold, the sword, given the privilege to hold the power of the sword in a government, why are they required to take that and make that declaration? I think if you asked most lawmakers today, and you asked most judges today, or prosecutors or law enforcement officers that carry the sword, why they have to make that affirmation, they won't be able to tell you. They'll probably say something like, "Oh, it's tradition. It's just kind of something that we do as a matter of that we've done for years." No, the reason that you do that is to remind yourself before you are given the privilege of exercising power over life or death of another human being, before you're given the privilege of exercising power of taking somebody's personal liberty away, perhaps for the rest of their natural life, you have to remember from whence your power comes from. It doesn't come from man. It comes, there is a higher power that you are always going to be subject to, a higher right and wrong. And an example that I can try and maybe help you understand that in a strong way is when the Nazis were tried at Nuremberg for all their atrocities after World War II. They had a defense. I was just following the law. I didn't break any law. In fact, I was following the law. Here's the German law that I was following. How can you now prosecute? Well, it was crimes against humanity, and it was recognized in that court that there was a higher law, that law that God puts on our heart, that there is a knowledge and an understanding that there's a right and a wrong, and a good and a bad, and a just and an unjust. And so those who are the lawmakers must understand the proper foundation for their authority. That's why you take the oath. And I think, the folks that defeated us Americans when we tried to invade Canada, when they put, the nation of Canada together, the law, they understood, your founders understood the basis of an official's legal government authority. That there was law, but then there was a morality, there was an ethical aspect to that law that is revealed in God's absolutes that are naturally on our heart. Let me, draw a little picture here, and hopefully it'll show up on screen. If I can get the light right. Every law is based in an ethical notion. Every law asks the question and then answers the question, what is right and what is wrong? What is good and bad? What is just and unjust? And so the question then becomes, how do you measure right and wrong? Do you look to God's standard? Do you measure it against God's standard? And what's God's standard? God puts the standard, on our heart. And so we can know right and wrong. I'm sorry, I got these cameras backwards. Right and wrong, just and unjust, good and bad. Revealed to us by God in his word and in his creation. Think about, the American Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, endowed by their creator, with a capital C, certain unalienable rights. Well, why are we hold these truths why are they self-evident? Well, because God put them on our heart. Now, the alternative worldview is a squiggly line. It's not a line on our heart where we know right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust. It's a whatever we feel like today. It's all about me and my personal autonomy and my identity, and what's right for you is in law is right for you, but what's right for me in law is right for me. And what's good for you in law is maybe good for you, but what's good for me in law is good for me. And what you may find true in law is true for you, but it doesn't have to be true for me. We don't have a line, a standard, a plumb line. We don't have something we can look to go back and forth, right and wrong. We get to just make it up as we go along, and who's ever in power decides and makes the final call on what is right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust with regard to law. And so when we're talking about morality that has to be part of law, we're talking about a standard, a set of absolutes which we can live by, both individually and as a nation. Something is either moral or immoral, never changing, no matter what the situation is, right or wrong, good or bad. Alternatively, from the secular progressive worldview, man or human beings are the measure of all things, always evolving. It's an always evolving relative standard. And whatever right or wrong depends on who's in power. Because we've got such powerful influences in academia and in media and in the entertainment world, it's become very difficult for us to even see the truth anymore. Not that the truth's not there, but it just doesn't get talked about, or it gets misrepresented, or it gets punished if you utter it out loud. And we need to be able to those that are disagreeing with us, show that truth exists, that it matters with regard to law. And, a couple of things. If Daryl had said, why don't you fly out to Vancouver and why don't you do this live at my house? I would have had to get on a airplane, probably in some place like Detroit or Toronto. And I would have had to go from Detroit. I would have had to go on north, and then I would have had to go west, and I would have been able to get to where Daryl is at. But if I would have woke up on the day that I was flying and say, you know what, it's all about, what I think. It's not about truth. I say north is south and east is west. And I'm going to get on the plane, and I believe, and I really believe it. I'm so passionately, emotionally believing that north is south and east is west, that I would be in Washington, D.C. landing before somebody would slap me in the face and say, you idiot. Truth matters. There is, there are some standards. They're right and wrong. And as much as they apply to the navigation equipment on a commercial jet, they certainly apply to law as well. Assume there's this professor that is driving at night, and it's late at night. There's not very many cars. It's a long road, and he comes to an intersection that has a stop sign. Now, again, it's very quiet. He's been driving along. He sees the stop sign. He slows down, and he looks, on both sides, doesn't see anything as he slows down, but he proceeds through the intersection without stopping, right through the through the stop sign. Well, on the other side of the intersection is a law enforcement officer, police officer, and the police officer pulls over the professor, and the police officer says, "Let me see your driver's license, please." And in America, they'd say license and registration. And the law professor looked at the police officer and says, "Well, why did you stop me? I didn't do anything wrong." License and registration, please. "Why did you stop me, officer? It's late at night. There's nobody out here. I slowed down. I didn't do anything wrong." "Step out of the car, sir." And so the professor gets out of the car, and the law enforcement officer takes out his nightstick, and he begins beating on the professor. And the professor says, "Stop, stop, stop." And the officer says, "Are you sure you want me to stop, or do you want me to just slow down?" Morality and ethics as part of law matters. The moral standard matters. Otherwise, what the law enforcement officer was doing during the beating wouldn't have been considered wrong. Otherwise, what the professor did when he drove through the stop sign would not have been considered wrong? How do we get to the right moral outcome if we don't first understand and believe that there is a right moral outcome, and that there is a God that sets that standard. The Bible is clear. If rules or laws do not mean anything, then we head to chaos, and that's all that we can expect. Now, both in the Canadian Charter and in the American Declaration, we see the Christian worldview lens, the influence of that lens in understanding that there are these to be these moral absolutes that are part of law. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Why are they self-evident? Because God has given us these moral absolutes, and the Bible teaches us that they are on our heart. And it goes back to what Darrell was talking about when he was talking about the laws of nature, natural law, and nature's God. The preamble to the Canadian Charter, whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And then the Charter lists the freedoms from whence they come. So from where does freedom and liberty come? If you look at it through the proper worldview lens, it comes from God. Do we still see the rule of law as intrinsically sacred? Do we still see the rule of law as a sacred standard revealed to us by God? Or is the rule of law now become a morally relative squiggly line given and determined by who's ever in power on any given time? What are these things in law that are intrinsically sacred and morally self-evident? Both the Canadian founders and the American founders understood that those moral absolutes existed in law. They understood the sacredness of life. They understood the sacredness of the importance of the free exercise of your religious conscience and the sacredness of worship, the sacredness of family and marriage between a man and a woman and why that was important, the sacredness of your property, the sacredness of keeping your word and your promises, and how important and how sacred life was, the Imago Dei, made in the very image of God. And both the Canadian forefathers and the American forefathers looked to those same standards when they formed the nation and when they when they published their laws, and the law attempted to reflect those standards. Now, again, we're not talking about a theocracy, but we are talking about the lawmaker being allowed to look to God's truth when the lawmaker, does his or her job. That's very, very different. We're not talking about a theocracy, but we are saying that. Well, wait a minute. As Darrell pointed out, in the secular world, that's a belief system. And certainly every lawmaker that is an atheist looks to, secular principles and are influenced by secular principles. And so it's certainly, and I loved your approach in Indonesia, it certainly should mean that the Christian person, who also has and I would suggest a much more legitimate worldview, because our truth actually corresponds to reality as opposed to theirs, which does not so often, ought to be able to, look to those standards and have those standards be part of who they are as well. And so, what's the best legal form of government. When you're talking about law and you're wanting to, form a government, yeah, I can tell you, if you asked what's the basis of law and why did we form our governing structures and our justice systems and our legal systems, the way they did, somebody might point to, that the Canadian forefathers and the American founders, they read Enlightenment thinkers, they read people like Montesquieu and understood notions of separation of power. But I can tell you right now, and we can show this because, there's been some very good research, some academics have done some very good work on this. They certainly did read those, and we shouldn't pretend like they didn't read Montesquieu and Locke. But they also read the Holy Bible that talked about, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our King. It is he who will save us. And why in places like Canada and the Commonwealth countries, and why in the United States do we separate power? Well, it's because, our founders understood that all have sinned and fallen short. They understood that Lord Acton's statement that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They understood that all have sinned and fallen short. So we're not going to put all that power in one place. And let me, use this baby rattle as an example. If you have a baby and you give the baby a rattle, and the baby is playing with the rattle, and now you introduce a second baby into the rattle playing game, does the first baby crawl over and say, oh, here, let me share this rattle. We're all born good. We're not born sinners. We're all born good. Let me share this rattle with you and let's just play nicely together. Does that ever happen? No, that never happens. I've used this example. I don't always use a rattle because depending on what culture you're in, babies play with different things. But I've told the story all over the world in many different cultures, and every mother in the audience, they say the same thing. They'll tell you exactly what that baby says, and you can probably do it here as well. Instead of saying, oh, I'm going to share this rattle with you, let's play nicely together. If that second baby wants to partake in the rattle playing, the first baby will say, no, it's mine. It's mine. You're not going to play it. And those babies in the rattle playing days, they grow up and they become law. Some of them become lawmakers, some of them become judges, and some of them become lawgivers, and some of them become, those who execute the law and carry out the law as the king. And those who came before that understood that. And that's why in the law-making process, they said, we are going to divide power, and we're not going to put the rattle all in one place. We're going to put it in three different places. We're going to put it in separate places, and each one of these places is going to be able to place a check on the law-making aspect of the other places. And so the reason that you see this separation of power in the Commonwealth countries and places like the United States and in a number of other countries around the world is because those that are putting a lawmaking process together, they understand the sinful nature of man and how that sinful nature, when coupled with power, when you take that sinful nature and you give him the sword and you give him the power, how dangerous and doubly dangerous that can be, especially if you take God's truth and God's morality out of the picture. Because once you take God's morality out of the picture, all you're left with is the sinful nature of man. And when you add that aspect of power, that can be a very dangerous thing. In my position at the Department of Justice and my position in the United States courts, the decisions I made on a daily basis sometimes would depend on, it could depend, it had the power to depend sometimes on whether somebody would live or die, or whether somebody would go to prison for the rest of their life. When you give that kind of power in the human realm, if you don't have a notion that there is a higher truth, so help me God, that you remember every day when you go into that realm, it can be a very dangerous thing, which is why God is involved. And it's why those who came before us were very concerned that, especially in the executive side of things, that king could become a very dangerous person. In our Federalist Papers, those are the writings that were being used to support the American Constitution. Federalist 51 said, if men were angels, we would not need separation of power. Again, Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. For hundreds of years, for thousands of years, we have understood that when it comes to law, it matters that God is involved and that God's truth that has to correspond to reality, that those moral absolutes are what separates tyrants from the rule of law. And so the law-making authority must know the foundation for something when they call it good or when they call it evil. It can't just be what they want. There has to be a standard they can look to. Ravi Zacharias has an amazing, I wish I could have him tell the story on one of his videos. And seeing him in person when he tells it is just, it's so compelling. You've probably had it happen to you when you drive up and you're stopped at a stoplight. And have you ever had the feeling when you are driving and you're stopped at a stoplight waiting for the light to turn green, that all of a sudden you kind of feel like you're moving forward, and you don't, but you don't know if you're moving forward or if the car next to you is moving forward. And if you're looking at the car next to you and you're looking and you're in the thing, you get this, it's kind of a weird feeling if you've ever had it. Am I moving into this dangerous intersection or not? Well, what do you do when you're in that situation? Well, obviously the first thing you might do is step on the brake, but let's say you don't have a brake. What would be the first thing you would do? Would you look at the car next to you to determine whether or not you were moving or stationary? No, you would look at a building. You would look at something that was stationary. You would look at something that was objective, that wasn't going to change, that way, that would allow you to know whether or not you were going forward or not going forward, whether or not you're going into a danger zone or not. And so, that is what we're talking about here. When the law-making authority must know the basis for calling something good or bad, right or wrong. Otherwise, they're just going to do it, on their own, and you can just make it up. Oh, I can just make it up whether or not I'm moving forward or not. Well, you better hope you're right, because if you're not right, and if you are different than what the moral absolute says, you're going to go right into, the busy intersection and crash, and burn. And so, again, the answer, to this problem was given to us by, the American founders. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're all created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. We can look, to our heart. We can know the right and wrong. If government interferes with our freedom of speech or our free exercise of our religious conscience, or they take our liberty without due process, we can know that there are some moral absolutes out there. In other words, the rights of human beings and people do not come from the state. They come from our Creator. And it's the role of government to preserve and protect, using the rule of law, such liberty. Because if that's not the case, if government gets to decide that what your legal rights are, where the law comes from, and they become the lawgiver and not God, well, if the government can tell you what your liberty is and give you the liberty, as opposed to it naturally occurring and it's there from God, that can't be taken away, and it's there from the beginning of time, and it's going to be there till Jesus returns. But instead they say, no, that's not true. Your liberty, we give that to you. Well, if government gives you liberty, what can it do? It can also take it away. So if government is the law and is the moral standard, and they remove the truthful moral standard, then you have what's happened to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. Whereas Canada, founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, and then those freedoms come from that truth, you know, that truth, in reality, no king, no parliament, no prime minister can ever take that truth away. But what's happened? It's been taken away. Canadian court decisions expressly, almost laugh and spit on that truth. And just so you can see that it wasn't all that way, that the lawmakers that came before you, they had a different worldview lens through which they saw the law. Don Stransom, 1778, a legislator, a lawmaker. He founded the Ontario school system and 3 universities. He put on this lens every day when he read his Bible. And a nation required an established church with a completely integrated educational system. Again, not a theocracy, but influenced and understood that it's okay, to have God as part of the marketplace of ideas. George Brown, another lawmaker, one of your early lawmakers. He stood for having specific denominations. He had a very strong legal position that all education should have a Christian worldview, and that whether you're teaching whatever you're teaching, whether you're teaching science or whether you're teaching government, whatever you're teaching, that Christians ought and Christian peoples ought, both in the mode of doing it and by example they set before the students. In other words, if you're going to have a moral society, you have to have people teaching all the issues through the proper lens. Edgar Ryanson, civil servant, again, a lawmaker, but he was also a Methodist minister. How often do you have, ministers who are now your lawmakers? The plan was to make men Christians in heart and life. Again, putting the correct lens on when you go out and do the law making. Fundamental Christians of Christian theology. That's what curriculums ought to look like. And so the first requisite is the religious and moral knowledge of right and wrong. So these, are the early thinkers of the Canadian nation. Every single one of them put on the Christian worldview lens. And so, Honest John Robeson, another lawmaker, said the Bible should be used in classes, said the Lord's Prayer should be recited, said Christian moral training should be provided. Every one of these early lawmakers understood the basis and the foundation for what made law. And if you remove that moral aspect, they understood that chaos would result. Toronto the Good, he's the mayor of Toronto, another lawmaker. Let's keep the city a God-fearing city. Unless the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. He was quoting Psalm 127. All right, this is from whence you came. Now, how did we get to where we are? If you're starting at a place where, if you want the republic to survive, if you want the legal and justice systems to survive, that the law had to be based in moral grounds, and there had to be good morals as part of the law, and that they had to therefore reflect God's standard, because that's where you find the correct, truthful morals, not some other place like Sharia law, because again, truth has to correspond to reality, not just what those in power are saying are true. Politics and law and religion now, according to everybody that you talk to in Canada, academic systems or in their government or the American system, they've got to be separate. Is it still true? Is that that foundation of morality as an essential foundation for law still true in Canada? No, not at all. No longer true in the United States. We know that truth that was so self-evident for those early Canadian lawmakers and the early American lawmakers was that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, God. They started from there, and then they went on and built, from there. And we know that in the New Testament, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes through the Father except through me. That's a pretty big statement. And if you start with that statement, and you are a lawmaker, you're going to come to a very different place than if you are a lawmaker who is an atheist who says there is no God. It's all about me. It's all about my personal autonomy. It's all about my identity. And I hold power now. And so by goodness, you are going to understand what good is and bad is because I'm going to tell you. And under the force of law and punishment, I am going to make sure that I enforce what I think right and wrong is. And so that's the battle we're in when it comes to the law and justice is, are we going to take God's approach where we know that there is a standard that we can look to both individually in our own conduct and, as a government? Or are we going to say, no, it's all about me. There is no standard. There is no truth. There is no right and wrong except as I define it because I hold power. That's very different than the moral absolute. When Jesus was in front of Pilate, he says, for this reason I was born, for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth, Jesus said, listens to me. That's a powerful statement, we know, because the other side of that coin is that if you're not listening to me, it's not true. And it's so amazing to me how my faith gets strengthened every day when I see how the reality corresponds to God's truth. And for something to be true, it has to correspond to reality. And that certainly is the case with regard to the law. There is a right and wrong. There is a correct and a not correct. There is a good and there is a bad. There is a just and there is a non-just. Jesus came and he gave us that truth. The great lawmakers that came before us understood that, where the great lawmakers made law understanding that a nation can be free and prosperous. You take away that truth, and we'll eventually be on a road where we'll be neither of those things. So choose your beliefs well, folks, because we'll live by them and we'll die by them. And those who came before us understood that. They chose God's standard. It's my prayer that for the lawmakers of the future, that we are able to, with the right heart, be able to not just destroy, not just defeat their arguments, but to help them see the truth. For whatever reason, God made me a lawyer, and lawyers are trained to argue. That's, I don't change a tire very well, and don't even think about asking me to fix a leaky faucet because God didn't give me the ability to do that. for whatever reason, he gave me the ability and other lawyers like me to be able to argue. But just because we're able to argue with somebody on the other side and reduce them into a puddle on the floor where they're crying on the floor because their arguments have been torn apart, understand that God doesn't call us to just win the argument. He also calls us to win their soul. And so, how we make our arguments matter. And just because, we can, um, and with training like Daryl is giving us, be able to, at the end of the day, be smarter than the other guy. The other challenge that I have for you is to do it in the right way, because the Bible says, not just to be able to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have, but to do it with compassion and with respect. And I believe that when we do that, we will honor God. We will win the argument, but then we'll also hopefully win more for Christ. So that's my talk tonight, and I'll be happy to try and answer some questions, except for like nothing from the professor or Daryl, who are too smart probably. And
I'm gonna unmute everybody.
No, anybody can ask.
Okay, let me unmute everyone.